So this is where we're at right now. We have this object that spawns. So let's first set up our level to be correct, okay? Another thing too, I kind of want to disable the little state labels in Playmaker. Okay, so I'm going to just turn those off. I'm also going to position the camera. I'm actually going to go here. I don't really like the camera being up so high, so I'm going to just reset the camera completely and then move it back. So this is kind of where the camera view is. So here's my player, left and right. Okay. And I just want to set up a couple walls to left and right. You guys should have already done this, but I'm going to set up a pillar. And let's just make sure that these are all lined up together, the spawner and the player and the pillar. So these are all positioned on top of one another. Okay. I can even scale these things up a little bit. This is all stuff that you guys have already done, right? I hope. Okay. Nothing that new, just pillars to left and right. Okay. I could actually move this guy a little bit more too. Okay, so we have this spawner, we have our level that prevents me from moving left and right, which is important. In the lab though, notice my guy can actually move forward, which we want to disable as well. So we're going to go to the player. We're just going to go to his get axis vector. We're going to delete the vertical axis because we don't care about moving up and down. We don't want the player to be able to move up and down. A couple other properties I want to tune here. It takes them a little while to start up and stop moving. So let's tune that a little bit while we're here. This isn't in the lab, but you can do this anyway. I'm going to crank his multiplier up to be 20 to make him just be able to move faster at top speed. So he moves much faster top speed. But he kind of like winds down, like he kind of like slows down, so we can actually improve that too. If you go to project settings here, and go to input, there are properties here for horizontal and vertical input. The property here you care about is gravity. Gravity is by default set to a pretty low number. This is how many units per second it stops putting input in. So if I crank this up to be like super, super high for both, not that I use this one, but this is not that I use vertical, but in case I do. Now when I let go of the keyboard, he immediately stops as opposed to kind of slowing down to a stop. Okay. Cool. So there's my level. All right, so I kind of want this thing that's spawning to be able to move left and right. It's already creating objects that I can collect and hit. And if all I have to do is be able to move it left and right, so we could use an iTween for this. And an iTween works well for platforms that move on a specified path that have a known kind of movement. The problem is it kind of doesn't really work great for something that has to move continually and randomly. So instead of using the iTween, we're just going to use it as, we're just going to treat this object as if it's a physics body, which means I'm going to add a rigid body to it, which means now by default it gets affected by gravity, so it's going to fall. We don't really want that, so we're going to turn off the gravity on this thing. But also now that it's a rigid body, I can do things to it. I can actually have it move with velocity. So if I go to the spawner, I can add a new FSM. I'm going to name this one moving. And I'm going to call this state moving. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to set the velocity on this object. Now if I just go here and I type 3, and I do this every frame, and I click play, the spawner by itself starts moving, which is perfect, which is exactly what I want. If I set this to be -3, it'll start moving negative, or 3, or -3. So all I have to do is take this value and kind of switch it from 3 to -3, and it'll actually start moving it backwards and forwards too, right? So what I want to do is I want this thing to move. Instead of typing a number here, though, I'm actually going to use a variable to control. Because I need a variable so that I can change the direction when it hits the end of the wall. When it hits the actual walls on either side, I want to flip direction. So I want the walls to handle that behavior. All right, so I'm going to go to variables. I'm going to make a global variable because I want anyone to be able to edit this. And I'm going to make a new vector 3. I'm going to call this one direction. And I'm going to default this movement to be 3 units in x. And I'm going to go back to my state and choose that variable here and press play. And it still moves. Cool. Now what I want it to do is I want it to kind of bounce, like go from one end of the wall to the other whenever it's moving. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to add another FSM for that. We'll go here, add another FSM. I'm going to call this one collision. And the behavior of the spawner hitting the wall is actually very similar to a trigger that you enter. Only this time I don't really want the spawner to act like a trigger. I just want to know when it like hits something. When one physics object hits another, you can actually hook into that. So I'm going to say waiting for a wall in this state. And while we have a trigger event that handles when we collide with a trigger, we also have something called a collision event, which handles when we touch objects together, when one physics object touches another. So in this case here, this collision event will fire when I hit the wall. So let's make a new event here that says hit a wall. I'm going to choose that in the drop-down box here. And another step here is that I only want this thing to fire when I actually collide with a wall. So I'm going to go to the walls themselves, the 2 walls that I've actually placed in a level. I'm going to click both of these things. And I'm going to go to this untagged drop-down box. I'm going to add a new tag. And I'm going to add a wall tag. Now I can go back to the walls, click on both of them, and I can assign them the wall tag because the spawner itself is only going to collide with the wall. Cool. And then all I have to do is in this second state, I'm going to have it reverse directions when it hits a wall. And when it's done reversing directions, I'm just going to have it go back and wait for another wall again. Reverse direction is going to do one thing only, which is going to take the direction variable that I made earlier and just flip it from positive to negative or from negative to positive. And the nice thing is that there's already an action for flipping or multiplying a vector to another vector. Vector 3 multiply. I can take the vector, which is direction here. I can just multiply it by -1, which will flip the direction of it. So if I watch this state run, when this spawner is moving in a direction, as soon as it hits a wall, you're going to see that state transition occur. It's going to bounce and go in the other direction.
Oh, fantastic.
But it's flying off into nowhere, and it kind of just gave up on life and just collapsed into the floor. So there is a downside to having this thing be a rigid body, which is that this thing kind of reacts to forces in weird ways. It's like, no, screw. So what's nice is that Playmaker lets us control how a rigid body behaves. So in this rigid body component for the spawner, we can constrain the rotation and movement of this thing. We can basically freeze its movement as well as its rotation, which we want to freeze everything except for just the x-axis. This thing is only allowed to move as if it's on a rail, left and right. So by locking everything else, it's going to prevent it from actually moving out of place. So now it'll bounce back and forth properly. Okay. Cool. Now, the next lab is, I'm already hitting spacebar to spawn, but there's no reason for me to have to hit spacebar. Let's just set a Playmaker to have this thing spawn automatically for us. So in our spawning component, and keep in mind now that I have 3 FSMs on a single object, this little drop-down box up top is really very convenient for switching between the 3 FSMs. So I can go to my spawning one. Right now it's based on whether I push a key down or not. Let me just delete that and instead put it on a wait. I'm going to set the wait to be like 0.3 and then have it say go ahead and spawn. And that's it. So I just replaced the key down with a wait. And now it'll spawn automatically every 0.3 seconds. Okay. Cool. One final thing before I give you guys the homework, and then we'll pick this up next week as far as all the rest of the pieces. The thing that makes this a game is actually very, very minor, but it makes a big difference. Like right now, there's actually not really a game here. Like it's kind of like you don't really have any things that you have to worry about. It's always going to be moving in a predictable way. There's not really any challenge to just walking over here and picking up the balls. There's no real variance in it. So what we should do is, how about randomly, after it spawns a ball, let's give it a chance to just change directions, right? If it randomly changes directions after it spawns a ball, that'll actually make it much more interesting because it'll mean that I can't predict what direction it's going to go. So it's actually very easy. In this spawning state, we already are making an object, and then we're going right back to spawning another one. We can use a new action that Playmaker has. That's called random event. And this one here, we want to use the send random event one. This one is nice. It'll randomly pick an event to fire, and it lets you actually control how often that happens. So first of all, I want two possibilities after I spawn a ball. One, the spawner just keeps going normally. Or two, the spawner will actually just change direction. And because there's only two outputs, I'm going to pick two events here. And I can pick one that's finished, and I'm going to add another event for change direction. And I'm going to plug that here. And I'm going to have change direction fire 30% of the time, which means finished will fire 70% of the time. So I can add a new transition here. So change direction will go here, which I'll call the change direction state. And then here, I'm going to do another vector3 multiply on the direction. And when it's finished, go back to waiting for spawn. So this state machine now looks like, hey, after you spawn, randomly either finish or change direction. And changing direction here is doing the same exact thing as what it does when it hits a wall. But now when I play, this thing will change direction 30% of the time. So you get a lot of that same behavior that you see in Kaboom, right? Like it's randomly kind of changing whether it goes or not. It'll still change direction when it hits a wall, but now it'll actually change directions more often, like randomly, 30% of the time. And this is kind of where I want you guys to tune it too. Maybe 30% is too much. Maybe I want 0.15 for 15% of the time. Whatever feels good to you. So here now I lowered the frequency to be 15%. So it'll still randomly change direction, but now when it hits a wall, it'll still bounce as well. And sometimes it'll stay on the wall. So this behavior actually mimics a lot with what Kaboom actually has, right? This looks pretty similar to what Kaboom's doing. And all it is just one action that changes the direction of something randomly. All right. So that's labs number 5 through 7. So I kind of want you guys to work on that. So take 5, 6, and 7. And then I will go over what we want to do for homework after everyone's done, right before class is over. So get to this point, basically get to what you see up here, where the spawner is moving randomly, and also changes directions. Okay? Yeah. Let me stop recording here.